Certain draft busts have achieved an infamous status as being some of the most iconic mistakes in NFL history, but sometimes busts travel under the radar, not widely discussed. Today we wanted to talk about some of the NFL's forgotten draft busts and hopefully remind you of some franchises' most forgotten draft mistakes. Press the like button if you think your team will be on this list somewhere. The first pick I wanted to talk about was the 10th overall pick in the 2000 draft for the Baltimore Ravens, and that is none other than Travis Taylor. Travis Taylor had played at the University of Florida and really hadn't been a consistent starter for the team. Despite joining in 1997 and leaving in 1999, he started just 11 games for the team. In those, he did play well, with 72 receptions for 1,100 yards and 15 touchdowns, but it wasn't like he had years and years of footage to analyze and make a detailed judgment. He had an incredible bowl game in the 2000 Citrus Bowl with 3 touchdowns, which really boosted his draft stock. The Ravens were looking for more options on offense, and with an elite defense, they decided to use their 10th overall pick on Taylor, with Ozzie Newsome thinking he could turn the player into an all-star caliber receiving threat. His rookie season was okay. He played in 9 games and had 28 receptions with 276 yards and 3 touchdowns, but considering he wasn't a primary target and the passing game was definitely lackluster, fans held their breath. In 2001, he improved and played in all 16 games with 42 receptions for 560 yards and 3 touchdowns. Those were fine numbers, but definitely not what you want out of a top 10 pick. The peak of his career came in 2002 when he had 61 receptions for 869 yards and 6 touchdowns, and many thought he was on the trajectory to dominate the NFL. However, Taylor drastically regressed in his next 2 seasons, with 0 touchdowns in the entirety of the 2004 season. Realizing their 10th overall pick was a dud, he was released from the Ravens at the end of the 2004 season. He went on to have 2 solid years in Minnesota with 600 receiving yards and 1 year with the Rams where he only caught 1 pass. While he would have had a fine career for someone drafted in the later rounds, the fact he as a top 10 pick never broke 1,000 yards in a season was shocking to many fans. The Ravens have never been great at drafting wide receiver talent, but this was just further proof to the young fan base that offense was not going to be their identity for some time. In fact, I'd argue it wasn't until Lamar Jackson where they really became known as an offensive threat, and even now they don't have a true star number 1 receiver. Zay Flowers is the best talent they've had in years, and he is just over 1,000 yards on the season, with Lamar in constant MVP discussion. Gaines Adams was a monster defensive end who had an incredible career at Clemson. While at first he wasn't a starter, he had earned the 12th Man of the Year award in his redshirt sophomore year. In his junior year, he had a breakout season with 56 tackles and 9.5 sacks with 3 forced fumbles. Going into his senior year, it was thought that he would be one of the best defensive ends in college football, and he delivered with 51 tackles and 12.5 sacks in his last year of eligibility. This sent his draft stock skyrocketing, but the 2007 draft would go down as being very low. The Buccaneers had the 4th overall pick, and they decided to choose Adams over other still available prospects like Adrian Peterson, Patrick Willis, Marshawn Lynch, Darrell Revis, Greg Olsen, and Joe Staley. While at the time, Buccaneers fans were cheering for this great pick. In retrospect, there were so many available Pro Bowl level players they could have chosen instead. He signed a huge 6-year, $46 million contract, and he followed up that payday by not making a solo tackle until 11 weeks into his rookie season. While he wasn't as explosive as he had been in college, he still had a fine freshman campaign with 35 tackles and 6 sacks. The following year, he had yet another okay season with 38 tackles, 6.5 sacks, and 2 interceptions. Many thought in 2008 that Adams had set himself apart as a potential franchise-defining piece of the defense, but in 2009, he wound up regressing quite severely from his previous play. In the first 5 games of the season, he had just 10 tackles, 1 sack, and 0 interceptions, marking a huge downgrade from his production in the first 2 years of his career. This was mainly due to his insistence he didn't need to practice or try as hard as he had done on the college level. His ego had allowed him to think his high level of play was pretty much single-handedly derived from his natural talent. The Buccaneers, realizing he would soon no longer have usefulness on their defense, traded him to the Bears in October in exchange for a second-round pick. Adams would go on to play in 10 games for the Bears, but his play had deteriorated so badly that he had just 7 tackles across those 10 appearances. Sadly, he would never have a chance to make a comeback, because in January of 2010 he was found by his girlfriend unresponsive in his home at 8:21 a.m. He was taken to the hospital where he was pronounced deceased due to a heart attack caused by an enlarged heart. No one knew he had any predisposed medical conditions, and no foul play or substance abuse was expected. Many say that before his untimely passing, he had been recommitted to the game of football, and it's a sad what if of what could have been if his career had continued. Tyson Jackson had played at LSU, where he earned a spot on the freshman All-SEC team and followed it up with an appearance on All-SEC times as a sophomore and senior. His senior year saw him scoring up 36 tackles, 4.5 sacks, and 10.5 stops for loss. His consistent dominance through the entirety of his college career had many thinking he would be a surefire success at the next level, and no one was more sure of this than the Kansas City Chiefs, who had the 3rd overall pick in the upcoming 2009 NFL Draft. While Jackson had played under a 4-3 scheme at LSU, many thought he would succeed even more in a 3-4 scheme instead. He impressed during his pro day and during the combine, so when the Chiefs came on the clock with the 3rd overall pick, no one was shocked when they selected Jackson. Initially, he held out demanding a monster contract. This holdout even went on through the training camp in the preseason. Anyone making the transition to the NFL is done a huge service by these training camp sessions, so many assumed him missing out on this would lead to a small decrease in performance. He wound up getting a 5-year contract worth $57 million, and he would play in all 16 games of his rookie season. This rookie season was a bit disappointing to say the least, with him having 38 tackles with 0 sacks as a rookie. His second season saw him drop quite a bit in terms of his production, but he did manage to get 1 sack in 2010. He proceeded to have his best years in 2011, 2012, and 2013, but his record for 2014 was not as good. Sacks in a season was 4 in 2013. He never really became the dominant force the Chiefs had been expecting. While he was a fine piece to have on the defensive line, and he could make tackles when he was needed to, that explosiveness and big playability that had made him the 3rd overall pick seemed to disappear. He had been dominant on the college stage for his entire career, but the transition to the NFL and competing against more competent offensive lines appeared to neutralize his ability. He would leave the Chiefs in 2013 and sign a $25 million deal with the Atlanta Falcons, but over 3 years in Atlanta, he didn't manage to make a single sack. After not making a huge impact and managing only 13 combined tackles in 2016, he was released from the Falcons and never played another down in the NFL again. While he did stay in the league for a while, he had the performance of someone drafted well outside of the top 3 picks. Byron Leftwich played at Marshall University, where he got early notoriety for winning the Motor City Bowl MVP in the absolutely insane shootout between Marshall and East Carolina that Marshall won in overtime 64-61. While the MAC isn't known for producing tons of NFL talent, it was undeniable that Leftwich was good. He won MAC MVP in 2001 and 2002 alongside Offensive Player of the Year in both seasons. Over his college career, he threw for nearly 12,000 yards, 89 touchdowns, with just 28 interceptions. While Leftwich didn't have a ton of name recognition before, by the time the 2003 draft was rolling around, he was clearly a top 10 pick in the upcoming draft. The pick that Leftwich was selected in was originally supposed to be the Vikings pick. They were hoping to move back and trade with the Baltimore Ravens so they could select Leftwich. However, the trade took too long to execute, and instead the Jaguars were moved up to the 7th overall pick where they selected Byron. They hadn't expected him to still be available when they were on the clock, but when he fell to them, they felt it was a no-brainer. His rookie season, he started 13 games and threw for nearly 3,000 yards and 16 touchdowns, and the following year would start 14 games throwing for nearly 3,000 yards once again. In 2005, he was off to an 8-3 start, on track for the best season of his career by far with a 3-to-1 TD to interception ratio. However, he would go down with an injury he would never be able to fully recover from. He was forced to have surgery on his ankle, and his backup, David Garrard, played great through the remainder of the season. This pushed him out as the Jaguars starter, and he was cut in September of 2007. While he would play well in his limited playing time after this, his days as a starter were mainly over. He would be the backup for the Falcons, Steelers, Buccaneers, and spend a few more years on the Steelers once again to finish out his career. While he was a fine journeyman quarterback, he was never able to be as talented as many thought he would be able to be in college. Once he had that serious ankle injury, most of his explosiveness had disappeared. His final career stats is a record of 24-26 as a starter, 10,000 passing yards, 58 touchdowns, 42 interceptions, and 415 rushing yards for another 10 touchdowns. That is definitely a respectable NFL career, but I can see how he was considered a disappointment by most Jaguar fans. I feel like that franchise in particular is notorious for draft quarterbacks in the first round that are just good enough not to immediately replace them until their rookie deal is up and repeat the process all over again. Florida has been really cursed ever since Dan Marino and Tom Brady played there. Next up, I wanted to stick with quarterbacks that played at Marshall and talk about Chad Pennington, who had started his career as a redshirted fourth-string quarterback at Marshall in 1995. However, a series of strange events forced him to end up playing the starting role. He miraculously led the team to the conference championship game where they fell short against Montana. The next year, he was redshirted in favor of Eric Kesser, but many thought he was the person who should have been playing all along. In 1997, Penning was allowed the starting role once again and led the team to their first bowl game victory in the Motor City Bowl. He won MVP of that game and then led the team to an undefeated season in 1999. They won the Motor City Bowl once again, and he finished 5th in Heisman voting the same year. He wound up with 13,000 yards and 115 touchdowns through his career. This career led to the New York Jets selecting him with the 18th overall pick in the 2000 NFL Draft. At the time, Vinny Testaverde was the set starter, and in his first 2 years, Pennington played just 3 times. He took over during the 5th game of the 2002 season and wound up taking them to a 9-7 record, which won their division. He threw for 3,000 yards and 20 touchdowns in just 11 games and had a quarterback rating of 104. However, the next year, Pennington suffered a fractured hand during the last preseason game of the year, and he was forced to miss the first 6 games of the season. He rushed his rehab process and would later say after that injury, his wrist was never the same again. Despite his serious injury, he had an okay season, and in 2004, the Jets signed him to a 7-year, $64 million contract. The Jets started 5-0, but Pennington again went down with an injured rotator cuff. He led them back to the playoffs, but in the offseason had surgery on his throwing shoulder to try to repair the earlier damage. He was injured yet again in 2005, and once again tore his rotator cuff, but in 2006 had his best statistical season yet. He won Comeback Player of the Year, but in 2007 he was benched and was released in August of 2008 when Brett Favre signed a contract with the Jets. He did have a short stint with the Dolphins after this, where he had his best year in 2008, but mostly was an okay quarterback for a majority of his career. This pick was especially disappointing because if he had been able to stay healthy, there's a good chance he would have had a very successful career. However, having season-ending injuries every other year is a good way to cut your career short. Courtney Brown was a great defensive end for the Penn State Lions who started his career in 1996. 1999 is when he had his huge breakout, being placed on the All-Big Ten team as well as being an All-American. He was Defensive Player of the Year and finished his college career with 33 sacks and 70 tackles for a loss. His level of dominance in one of the most competitive conferences had teams drooling over who would be able to get him on their team at the next level. Unfortunately for Brown, the Cleveland Browns had won the sweepstakes to have the first overall pick of the 2000 NFL Draft. As we know, anyone who goes to Cleveland is pretty much stepping into a meat grinder. He was chosen with the first overall pick and actually had a pretty great rookie season. He had 69 tackles with 4.5 sacks, and the next year was on an even better trajectory before he had a season-ending injury in his second season. He had 4.5 sacks over 5 games, but after his injury, he really never played the same way again. He came back for 11 games in 2002, but only ended up with 2 sacks, and in 2003 was having a career year before he had another serious injury and went out after securing 6 sacks in 13 games. He played in only 2 games in 2004 before he was released and picked up by the Denver Broncos in 2005. He did play in 14 games that one year in Denver, where his production was drastically lower than his peak seasons in Cleveland. However, the team managed to go 13-3 and eventually were defeated by the future Super Bowl champion Steelers in the playoffs. After that year, no team showed further interest, and he retired after that single season. I feel like Courtney Brown is the perfect example of a player that got a little too much hype coming into the NFL, and probably should have never been a first-round pick in the first place. It's not that he had a horrible career, it's that a #1 pick is supposed to be a franchise transformer, and Courtney Brown simply didn't fit the bill as that type of player. He had a fine NFL career, but was definitely a disappointment in the grand scheme of things. Our next player had his career derailed over legal trouble, and that player is Matt Elam. Matt Elam was the younger brother of NFL players Adram Elam and uncle of Kaiir Elam, who currently plays corner for the Buffalo Bills. He played college football for the University of Florida, where he played safety. In 2011, he had 78 tackles, 2 interceptions, and 2 sacks. In his junior year, he was a first-team All-American, All-SEC, and was a finalist for the Thorpe Award and Bednarik Award. In the 2013 draft class, he was extremely sought after, and the Ravens selected him with the 32nd overall pick in the 2013 NFL Draft. His rookie season was promising with 77 tackles, 1 interception, and 54 solo tackles. However, his second year saw him drop to 50 tackles with 0 interceptions. In 2016, he dropped ever further, playing just 9 games. And in early 2017, his legal troubles reared their ugly head. He was arrested in Miami, Florida in February in possession of 126 grams of everyone's favorite herb and 3.1 grams of oxys. He was charged with intent to distribute, which was later dismissed, and a few months later in May, he was charged with battery and theft charges over a dispute with his girlfriend over an iPhone Matt Elam had claimed to purchase. While the charges were later dropped, it was clear that he had his own issue handling his personal life, and he was released by the Ravens in February of that same year. He wound up spending several years traveling around the CFL, XFL, and Indoor Football League. He today is trying to attempt to make a comeback with the Massachusetts Pirates of the IFL, but he seriously hasn't developed enough to make it back to the NFL. While he was a very late first-round pick, being out of the league within 3 years of being drafted definitely classes him in the disappointment level. While the Ravens thought they were getting someone who could fill the hole left by Ed Reed when he left, he was more of a solid-tier player that shouldn't have been drafted in the first round in the first place. Kirby Criswell was a second-round pick in the 1980 NFL Draft. Drafted 31st overall, he would be a first-round pick under today's standards. The Bengals selected him thinking he could be a great piece for the franchise going forward. This pick was such a disaster that it didn't matter that he had a solid career at the University of Kansas as a linebacker. He didn't even earn a single season to prove himself and try to show coaches what he had. Even though he had been one of the first picks of the second round, he had himself cut before even the first preseason game of the year. Not even making it to a preseason game showed that the Bengals had totally bungled their pick, and even after Green Bay signed him off waivers, they still ended up cutting him 2 days later. It seemed like there was something at Kirby Criswell that just did not work in the NFL. Whether it be his work ethic or his outspoken personality not really clicking in the locker room, it seemed like everywhere he went there were issues that followed shortly. His passionate style often led to conflicts with other players on his team, and he had an ego that greatly outpaced his ability to make an impact on the field. Late in the 1980 season, he got yet another opportunity on the practice squad of the Cardinals. He did play in 4 games for the Cardinals. However, he broke his arm late into his first season and was placed on the injury reserve. Sometime between being placed on the injured reserve and coming off, he decided that dealing drugs could potentially be more lucrative than playing professional football. Obviously, that didn't work out too well for him since we are talking about it, and in early 1982, he was picked up on federal drug charges. He was found guilty for possession of everyone's favorite herb and also conspiring to distribute Breaking Bad materials. He was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison, and by the time he exited prison, no NFL team wanted to touch the situation with a 5-foot pole. He never played another down in the NFL, which I really can't say is surprising, especially for the time federal charges like that were a career death sentence. While now we are used to every other NFL player being convicted of a felony, at the time it really wasn't worth it for teams to take a chance on an average role player with a questionable record. While the draft has really been mastered by certain franchises to provide value even in late rounds, picks like the ones we talked about today make it clear that drafting really is not a perfect science, no matter how you slice it. While certain franchises like the Bengals seem destined to almost blow their early first-round picks, sometimes every franchise gets unlucky and ends up with a frog among princes. For every Peyton Manning is a few dozen duds that did nothing but take up lots of cap space and lead to losing seasons. I believe that as time goes on, the draft will become more of an exact science, but there is no way that draft busts are ever truly cut out of the process. Certain players once getting to the NFL just lose their work ethic and explosiveness that made them stand out in college. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to press the like button and comment down below. It really helps the video do better, and we are trying to hit 10,000 subscribers in the future and would really love your support. Thank you for watching. Our last video was one about the worst quarterbacks ever, and you should give it a watch. My favorite team was on this list a lot, by the way.